For those who like to observe birds, the coastal wetlands and estuaries of temperate Australia can be both frustrating and extraordinarily rewarding. This is because the environmental conditions in such areas are in a constant cycle of change. Many factors are involved. There is, of course, the daily tidal cycle, 2 high tides and 2 low tides every 24 hours. Every falling tide produces fresh foraging opportunities for birds and also triggers their own movements in response to water levels. High tides generally cause birds to move to high ground, and clear resting areas can be in short supply, so birds may be assembled together. Low tides allow birds to disperse, so instead of being able to watch a large number together, they may be few and far between. The moon cycle complicates this picture somewhat, particularly the occurrence of king tides, which are often disastrous for small waders who may nest close to the water's edge. King tides sometimes breach low barrier dams, allowing salt water to enter temporarily closed lagoons and lakes, dramatically changing salinity, waterweed communities, and therefore the type and quantity of food resources available to birds. The other huge factor affecting environmental conditions is the changing seasons, particularly changes in far northern or southern latitudes, which drives mass migrations to temperate Australia in summer, but also local seasonal migration or nomadism. A fairly typical estuarine wetland is the Shoalhaven Heads, Comerong Island area. Being tidal, the bird species encountered can differ somewhat to the mostly closed lagoons and lakes like Wallumbilla, which tend to be far less saline. Crab-eaters like curlews are much more likely to be seen at Shoalhaven Heads than Wallumbilla, but stilts and avocets, which feed on smaller water fauna found in waterweed, are more likely to be found at Wallumbilla. Of course, there are many species which occur in both areas, depending on local conditions. At Shoalhaven Heads estuaries, particularly on the northwest side of Comerong Island, there are small mangrove areas providing shelter for the locally less common nankeen heron, as well as the more widespread white-faced heron, white ibis, and several egrets. Year-round residents include the delightful red-capped plover, mostly seen in small parties or pairs, systematically hunting progressively exposed mudflats and sandflats. During the summer breeding season, flocks of 80 or more may alight on a feeding ground, stay for an hour or so, quartering the area, and then moving on to fresher options close by. A nesting pair will select a slightly raised hump of dry sand just above high water mark and lay 2 blotched eggs. Nests are sometimes further up and away from the water, but always in locations where there is a good view of the surroundings. Little attention is paid to camouflaging debris or shells. The parents are extremely shy and wary and stay away from a discovered nest site or employ the broken wing ploy, attempt to lead you away. They are best observed with binoculars from about 20 or more metres away. Unfortunately, many nests are destroyed by inundation during king tides because they are too close to the water. They are also particularly vulnerable to ravens, dogs, foxes, and human disturbance. Fortunately, they are very common. There are several other plover species which will be dealt with shortly. Another local is the pied oystercatcher, which again selects a sand hump to lay the eggs, but generally further away from the water and may even be in the dunes. Again, eggs are blotchy and camouflage well, so no foreign debris is required, though the nest hollow may be close to water-deposited material. When courting, the birds employ a fascinating bowing routine. When in a group, this almost takes on the appearance of a formal dance. Like the redcap, the breeding season for the oystercatchers is November and December. Young don't stay long at the nest site, perhaps only a few days, before following the parents on foraging trips. As with other shorebirds and waders that nest in the Shoalhaven, they can be very vulnerable to ravens, dogs, foxes, and human disturbance. Much rarer at Shoalhaven Heads is the sooty oystercatcher. This is probably because they like a more rocky shoreline and don't nest on the mainland but on offshore islands. Arriving in November are the godwits, curlews, sandpipers and Pacific golden plovers, which breed in the Arctic summer but leave there before winter to enjoy the warmth here in summer. Come March, though, most leave to return to the north. Often some may still be seen here in winter, mostly godwits, but numbers are usually very small. As autumn approaches, those remaining birds often begin to change into breeding plumage, which for godwits is a more rusty red colour. Despite the change, though, they do not breed here. Distinguishing between the black-tailed and the bar-tailed godwits is difficult, unless they are very close and good binoculars are available. Godwits often associate with sharp-tailed sandpipers, but are easily distinguished by size and bill length, even at a distance. Single curlews, too, may be seen occasionally year-round. They are usually very shy and frequent sand and mud flats away from human presence, where the changing tides continually refresh the food supply. The very long curved beak can be thrust to its full length into the sand to extract a crustacean or ragworm. How they detect this play at such a depth I can only speculate. At times, when conditions are suitable, eastern curlews can number up to 200, but such conditions don't prevail very often. By March, most have left the Shoalhaven for their home grounds in the Arctic Circle. There are about 6 sandpiper species that frequent the Shoalhaven in the summer. The most common is probably the sharp-tailed sandpiper. Included in this group are those known as knots, sanderlings, and stints. Unless you have had some years of experience, it may be quite difficult to correctly identify species for several reasons. The main problem is plumage. Being Northern Hemisphere species, when they arrive here during our summer months, they are in non-breeding plumage. Their distinctive colours and patterns have been replaced with a more nondescript plumage, which at first sight seems no different from other species. Size, beak length and stance can help, but these features don't help much at a distance. It may not be until the end of their season here that they have been accustomed to humans enough that they are more easily approached. They can be extremely shy when they first arrive. Sandpipers often flourish in shallow waterweeds and don't visit unless there are extensive areas available. When the weed begins to rot or aerobic conditions prevail, methane and sulfur dioxide gas make the area unpleasant and unproductive, so most birds leave. At Shoalhaven Heads, the presence of sufficient weed depends very much on salinity. Closure or opening of the river entrance changes water chemistry dramatically, so seagrasses may be almost completely absent for a time, which means that some waders, like sandpipers, don't find enough food. Less common than the sandpiper group are the Pacific golden plovers. They too nest in the Arctic and only visit here in the summer months. Small parties of 6 to 10 individuals seems to be the norm, though double that number or more is possible. Again, these birds are in eclipse plumage, but they do tend to be more distinctive and colourful than the sandpipers. When breeding, their upper parts are a patchwork of golden, buff and black feathers, while the underparts are jet black. Locally, though, the colour scheme is much more subdued, though still distinctive. Another migrant is the double-banded plover. They appear here in the winter, coming not from the Arctic but New Zealand. They may or may not exhibit some breeding plumage, but don't nest here. They vary a lot, adult males sporting a nice chestnut band across the breast, females and juveniles being fairly plain without much pattern in their feathers. A common local here is the masked lapwing, which is not actually a plover, though it is often still referred to as a spur-winged plover. They are quite common on sporting fields, public parks near the coast, and picnic areas. It nests in the open in very public areas, which brings it into conflict a lot with people. So it has a reputation for dive bombing people and dogs that stray too close to the nest site. At Shoalhaven Heads, in the same nesting area as that used by the redcaps and pied oyster catchers, we often have little terns. They migrate here from Japan, but the little tern has a worldwide range. In Australia, there are 3 separate populations, one which breeds on the beaches on the coasts of eastern and southeastern Australia, another which breeds in northern Australia and Cape York Peninsula and the top end, and a third which breeds in Asia, and then migrates to spend its non-breeding season in Australia, where it may intermingle with local birds. All populations of little terns forage by plunging into shallow water, taking small fish from on or just below the water's surface. If you stray near their nest site, they quickly take to the air with alarm calls. Indeed, if you are unaware of their presence, their alarm calls will alert you to the proximity of a nest or young birds. The most common tern here, though, is the crested tern, which often occurs in large numbers. They don't nest here, but choose the security of offshore islands. Occasionally, Caspian terns can be seen, but not in any number. The Caspian is a larger tern by about 50 millimetres, with a large red bill, and is quite noticeable when seen amongst gulls or crested terns. Crested terns are much more accustomed to people, and can be approached more closely than most other seabirds. Generally in small numbers, widely dispersed and relatively shy, are the heron family. The most common egrets are the greater and little egret, which are often seen stalking the shallows for shrimps and small fish. The great egret can be fairly tall, almost a metre. It develops long white plumes on the back only. Little egrets develop them on the back and may also have a couple of plumes on the back of the head. Legs are dark greenish black, whereas those of the adult greater egrets are generally yellow. However, at a distance it can be difficult to distinguish between the two species. White-faced herons are common, not just Shoalhaven Heads, but everywhere there are wet pastures, swamps, lakes and creeks. During the breeding season, they develop long plume-shaped feathers on the nape of the neck and back. Their call is a grunting croak, uttered on the wing when disturbed. The Nankeen night heron is seldom seen, preferring to frequent thickly forested estuaries in mangroves and casuarina thickets. They are predominantly nocturnal and are usually only seen when accidentally disturbed during daylight hours. The white-necked or Pacific heron occurs in the Shoalhaven, but is not likely to be seen at Shoalhaven Heads. Other seabirds and waders, like all the common cormorants, gulls, spoonbills, ibis and pelicans, occur at Shoalhaven Heads as well, and some less well-known migratory species in small numbers. I cannot attempt to describe them all here. Non-waders like black swans, often in significant numbers, and chestnut teal also occur. The best time to visit Shoalhaven Heads is from the end of August to the end of March, when most migratory species are here. But any time of the year can be a rewarding time for the patient observer.